This new panel will explore how technology can actually help, and already has helped, in delivering humanitarian efforts and aid. So please allow me to welcome to stage the next panel with participants Guy-Philippe Goldstein, Kristen Davies, Greg Forman, Anna Bulakh, who will be joining us via video, and she might have to, when there are sirens, return to the basement where there's no connection. Teresa, Hutson, and this panel will be moderated by Sten-Kristian Saluveer. Please welcome them on stage.
Good morning.
That's on the sitting zone.
No,
Tere.
Doesn't matter.
Tere, good morning.
Tere.
Okay, great. We have your attention. Thank you very much. If yesterday and this morning we talked about visions, the global gateway, trusted connectivity, new values, and etc., then of course the immediate question is, what are the next actions? What are our immediate actions? How can we actually build those new partnerships between agile innovators and companies that are already redefining the future that the Deputy Minister just presented us? How do we have corporate alignment? How do we have corporates to move into this space to start working for recovery? How do we actually work in areas such as landmine clearance? How do we catalyze ecosystems, understanding that Ukraine is one of the most mined countries right in the world? And when we think about digital, we always tend to think about technology, deployments, infrastructure, and so forth, but it's also very important to understand that parts of the infrastructure, as Prime Minister said yesterday, as well as the President said yesterday, that we also have to think about infrastructure as human capacities. We have to think infrastructure as trust capacities, and that also includes our informational spaces and our resilient spaces. And exactly about those topics we are going to talk about today. It is also important to remember that we need to talk about now, immediacy, speed, action, but we also need to think about the near future, the tactical future, and the strategic future. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Anna Bulakh, Head of Ethics and Partnerships at Respeecher. Respeecher is a company which is a leader in synthetic voice technology. Whilst in February, you might be enjoying Obi-Wan Kenobi or Star Wars, or you might have seen how James Earl Jones signed his voice off to artificial intelligence, yes? Well, Anna and her company members and the visionaries from Ukraine have built that technology. What is the situation in Ukraine, what the technology can teach us, and what types of new frameworks of resilience and leadership in partnership with Ukraine in emerging technologies we can actually have. Anna, thank you for joining us from these rather extraordinary conditions from Kiev.
Yes, hi everyone. I think yesterday was quite a stressful day for all of us. Now there is another raid alert in Kiev, but I'm in our office where I live nearby, and yesterday several missiles landed just 1 kilometer from us. If I could, I would be joining you from another a room in office, and behind me you would see several Emmy statues. But we have them in our office, and I think that those are the only ones physical Emmy statues that you would find in Ukraine. But what I wanted to talk more as the head of ethics and partnerships at Respeecher, and what I do is I develop ethical and responsible application of emerging technologies globally. Ukraine has shown its huge capacity of developing AI-based solutions. And some of those solutions, such as synthetic media, are those that affect an information ecosystem worldwide. Deepfakes in synthetic media are used not only in entertainment industry, but also have a wide application in healthcare, but also can be abused and be used in psychological warfare. But my background is from security and defense, and for the past 5 years, I've been heavily involved in technological sector. What taught me that internet sovereignty, what it is as a definition, internet sovereignty are those regulations that are created by corporations and policymakers, regulators are no longer agile and respond to the current asymmetric threats that we are facing. And in Ukraine, we do really understand those threats because we are encircled in those threats. So, new reality. What is new reality? A new reality for technologies and applications. It's a speed, impact, and ethics. When I talk about speed, I talk about those emerging technologies, AI-based solutions such as synthetic media. They go far beyond that policymakers and regulations can catch up. And I do know that on practice because at Respeecher we are leading several committees on synthetic media application and its ethical application worldwide. And we as a small company and fast-growing startup leading those committees because we do understand that regulations are not keeping up with basic impact. When building such novel technologies that can affect societal security, we do have to measure the impact. And at small companies with those emerging technologies, we already do that, even based in Ukraine. But we do understand our impact globally. And again, we do understand the threats. And third, ethics. Without those, as Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, shaped it as responsible AI, we still shape it as ethical AI, but it all is based on those values that we share in Western democratic societies. And how I shape it in the digital Cold War messages that I'm trying to outreach now is that we are divided by the wall where new novel technologies are built on the shared values, and on another wall that is Russia and China that do oppose those values. But how can we make responsible and ethical AI emerging technologies correspond with those novel and new threats that we are seeing daily now? Of course, it's a new frameworks of cooperation where small tech, big tech, and policymakers are framed and meet with each other, and where small tech is supported with also another triangle is money, time, and new frameworks. New funding opportunities that can empower small tech, as for example, Respeecher is, to go further and bring those know-hows on how to mitigate the abuse of new technology, emerging technology, share that experience, engage with big tech and policymakers, and make it in more agile and most practical way possible. That is why money, time, and new frameworks are essential. And I would just highlight here the framework in another triangle is resilience is how those frameworks are shaped and built. Of course, it's communication, it's capacity, and values. Values is a trust-built framework of cooperation. Values highlight everything, right? We are encircled by the threats. We do understand who our partners are. But when we talk about communication, it's essential that public-private partnership and small tech, big tech, and regulators meet in one place and essentially constantly doing so because we do understand that speed, impact, and ethics are valuable. And the third point in angle of resilience is capacity. We do understand that in emerging technologies, capacity belongs to smaller tech. As we understood it and we see it at Respeecher, that our technology is already heavily used in Hollywood, but we're also integrating and applying our technology in healthcare and are ready to develop detection systems for deepfake voice. That's why I call for everyone here to include and think of this new framework of small tech, big tech, and policymakers in one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think we need to give a big applause to our Ukrainian heroes joining us in Kiev in those extraordinary circumstances. Thank you so much. So what we heard, Ukraine is a world leader in emerging technologies, in synthetic media, artificial intelligence, those areas that Europe and our transatlantic partners want to be the leaders on. Not only on A-list productions, but really saving lives or giving back lives in the front. So we need speed, immediacy, communication, and trying to think about frameworks how policymakers and corporates can work with agile startups, not as last, but first of implementing those technologies in an environment of Cold War. One of the important and one of the really critical aspects about this new battlefield that needs new frameworks of trust and collaboration is actually landmine clearance. Kristen, you have worked as a director of IT for New York Times, but quite pivoted into this very important cause, taking your skills in building trusted connectivity and networks in landmine clearance. Can you a little bit tell about that operational model?
Certainly, thank you, Sten. I am the US chair of the board for Apopo. We are scent detection experts. What does that mean? We train animals, rats and dogs, to use their amazing sense of smell to detect. We detect tuberculosis, we detect trafficked animals, we detect humans in collapsed buildings, but we're best known for detecting landmines. We've been doing this now for more than 20 years with our hero rats, and now with our technical survey dogs. These are dogs equipped with technology in backpacks. More than 60 countries on Earth are affected by landmines, and the most common way that we see for detecting them is a human being with a metal detector. You can imagine the complications this throws up when you're detecting in land that's been used for agriculture, industry, urban, or more recent conflict, because everything that that metal detector indicates on needs to be treated as a landmine. Apopo's animals are trained to detect not metal, but explosives. So when they're coming into a ground that's contaminated by a lot of metal, they're only going to indicate, and we will only need to treat as landmine any explosives that they detect. What this means is that we're able to have a greater impact, especially in terms of speed. Let me give you some data to share with you some data about this. Manual deminers can clear a square meter, and the cost there is 77 cents. Because we're only detecting explosives and not metal, one of our hero rats can clear that same square meter for 33 cents. One of our technical survey dogs, equipped with its backpack, can clear that same square meter for just 9 cents. So the impact we can have here is huge. But it's not just about the cost, it's about the speed as well. Our technical survey dog can do that square meter up to 10 times faster than a manual deminer. These are techniques and technologies that we've honed around the world, that we're looking now to work with Ukraine to help them rebuild. But clearing mines is only part of the problem as such. It's important for us to ensure that once we've cleared and made the land safe, it can be repurposed as rapidly as possible for economic, societal, and cultural and environmental use. So at Apopo, what we've done is we've now created a playbook where we partner with other NGOs that do this to get them in and on the ground as rapidly as possible once we have cleared and made that land safe. One example of this is with Cordaid Foundation in Cambodia. They're bringing in organic rice farmers. So as soon as the land is safe, we have environmental, cultural, and economic repurposing of that land incredibly fast behind us. All of this takes money. And this is part of the resilience that we need in humanitarian actions as well. Once we have funding in, it can take up to and above 6 months for us to actually action teams and for many humanitarian teams to get onto the ground. What we've been doing with Apopo and our connected, trusted partners is creating social impact bonds. This enables us to diversify the funding streams that we have. So historically, we've been very dependent, and we continue to be dependent on government funding. But by offering social impact bonds, what this means is we can go out with our partners to corporates, individuals, and other foundations to offer them investment packages that bring social impact and market rate returns. One example, with Cordaid Foundation in Cambodia, Apopo is partnered with the FCDO, the UK government, and we're now offering social impact bonds as a way of bringing in funding diversification and therefore building resilience. And that's something that we can also do for and with Ukrainians. But I just want to now focus on Ukraine and how we can do that, because that is why we are here today. Talking about that funding mechanism. At Apopo, what we're seeking to do, and this is a call to action to you also, is to reduce the time and increase the impact at which we can have miners, trained deminers with our technical survey dogs on the ground in Ukraine. Working with Ukraine, we want to take Ukrainians, find Ukrainians, and train them to be deminers with our technical survey dogs. We can do this. We have a training center up and running, and we're seeking currently $250,000 and Ukrainian partners and trainers, so that as soon as we have a green light to safely put our teams on the ground, we can do that not in 6 to 12 months' time, but in 1 to 3 months' time. So there's a capacity and a resilience point here. So to echo, in fact, what Anna was just saying to us, and thank you, Anna, part of the resilience and the rebuild in here is the speed and the impact, the capacity, and the values. And for Apopo, it's critical that we work with connected partners around the globe, but also within Ukraine to be able to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I understand you have a flight to catch.
I do have a flight to catch, so I have to leave right now. But on behalf of myself and all of my human and animal colleagues at Apopo, I want to thank you very much. Please do reach out to me via my panel members also if needs be afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm totally sure that when the Ukraine 2030 vision will realize, then here in Tallinn we shall have teleporters. So we'll be able to beam and out wherever we want to go in a matter of seconds. But I really want to echo Kristen's statements again, because landmine clearance is a huge topic. We should not only think about building digital infrastructure, we have to reclaim very much of the physical infrastructure as well, and trying to find models that bring together those larger investment schemes that were released or were presented yesterday, the $300 billion in the global gateway, combining that with a cutting-edge approach on science, but as well as thinking about how NGOs, investors, as well as government actors can move collaboratively in the trust space. And as Kristen and Anna said, in a very, very rapid deployment, a few months rather than 6 months or more is really critical. From here, we actually shift our dimension. As we said before, those issues on site are not very much tangible. Anna remarked, and she has put out recently an amazing white paper saying that we are entering the era of digital Cold War. It is a new norm. It goes beyond misinformation and disinformation. It is a hostile battleground that exceeds the dimensions of cyber. It encompasses our societies, our human actors, our digital actors, and so forth. So the question is, how can we actually fight it on scale? How can we bring together big players, small players, that agile knowledge with cutting-edge technology, such as AI for good? And to talk about how corporations are actively moving into this space, supporting Ukrainian resilience, Ukrainian capacity, I'd like to welcome Teresa Hutson from Microsoft, joining us today at a very early hour from Seattle. Teresa.
Very late hour. I mean, last night, actually, your last night. Yeah, this is, as each of the speakers has spoken so far, it really does bring home the fact that this is a multifaceted problem. You know, the panel title describes this, and you just mentioned this is a time of digital Cold War, and that couldn't be more true. Tech companies are in a unique position to lend their technical expertise to help combat the digital Cold War, where disinformation poses one of the most serious threats and risks, weakening the foundations of democracy worldwide. Over the past few months in the war in Ukraine, we've seen firsthand just how complex and multifaceted cyber operations are. So we've always traditionally looked at destructive cyber attacks, and we've certainly seen those. We've also seen cyber espionage efforts In the first half of the year alone, we delivered more than 120 intelligence tips about threat activity to Ukraine-based entities. But for the first time, we also started looking at the problem of agency-sponsored cyber influence operations, also known as disinformation campaigns, designed to support Russia's war aims. Not surprisingly, we're not talking about just one message and one audience, but multiple narratives focused on multiple audiences. I think we all knew that was true, but with our data, we can see it very specifically. We've identified 4 distinct audiences and 4 distinct messages. To the domestic Russian population, the Russians advance a goal of sustaining support for the war by portraying Ukraine's military as responsible for the conflict. To the Ukrainian population, they advance a goal of undermining confidence in the country's willingness and ability to withstand Russia's attacks. To American and European audiences, they aim to diminish Western unity and deflect criticism of Russian military war crimes. And to non-aligned countries, they aim to support Russian efforts at the United Nations and other venues, combining long-standing narratives demonizing democracy and Western intentions with an emerging effort to blame the West for potential food efforts. So how do you counter this? For one, as I noted, responses must be multifaceted. So we've approached this at Microsoft in a couple of ways. Like many content providers, starting in February, we stopped current content. Our Microsoft Start platform, which includes MSN.com, stopped displaying content from Russian state-sponsored news outlets, RT and Sputnik. We removed RT news apps from our Windows App Store and deranked both sources' search results on Bing. We banned advertisements from RT and Sputnik across our ad network and will not place any ads from our ad network on these sites. But we went beyond that. We have focused on tracking and calculating the creation and consumption of Russian propaganda. Our AI for Good lab created a Russian propaganda index to monitor the flow of news from Russian state-controlled and sponsored news outlets and amplifiers. This index measures the proportion of propaganda flow to overall news traffic on the internet, and we can enable it for geographic regions, online channels, and infrastructure providers such as registrars and web hosts. The lab also developed AI tools to begin to detect potential new propaganda sites as they appear, using data from a wide variety of internet sources and other identifying characteristics to determine and forecast new domains that may be candidates for foreign cyber influence operations. We don't do this alone, though. The technology is used in conjunction with sources from third-party reviewers like NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index to help us define which sites are known purveyors of state-sponsored media. This is really powerful because now we can chart the consumption of Russian propaganda across the internet and in different geographies on a precise timeline and truly see both the extent and the effectiveness of Russian cyber influence operations. In the initial weeks after the war began, we saw the consumption of narratives from Russian-controlled and sponsored sites across the internet rose sharply in both Ukraine and the United States, other places as well, but just by way of example. The surge in Ukraine represents an increase of 216%, while the spread of Russian propaganda in the United States increased by 82%. With a steady flow of Russian cyber influence operations, it's estimated that the average American consumption of Russian propaganda is 60 million to 80 million page views per month. This is enough to make the collective placement resulting from cyber influence operations on par with a major publication like the Wall Street Journal. We're also using technology to ensure the integrity of digital evidence. We're supporting the International Criminal Court to deliver justice for war crimes in Ukraine using Azure Cognitive Services to accelerate the collection and analysis of digital evidence, and working on an emerging project focused on the question of how you track digital chain of custody in order to provide international courts with authenticated images and videos. More to come on that. So I've really focused here so far on the bad information coming into the system. What's the antidote? So we also focus on the role of trusted journalism. As Russian propaganda about the war is on the rise, the role of trusted journalism is more important than ever, and it's a key indicator, as we know, of healthy democratic societies. Having trusted journalism requires journalists and the need to better understand the challenges they are facing and how the technology industry can support them. We need newsrooms to support journalists, and local newsrooms need our support. So we've invested in Report for the World's latest expansion to include newsrooms in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine, and we've partnered with the Ground Truth Project to support the second Report for the World cohort of new newsrooms that received a Reporter Corps member that included for the first time Eastern European news organizations in Ukraine and Hungary. We also need to better understand the challenges that journalists are facing so we can better help from the technology industry. We've partnered with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Media to connect with journalists and civil society activists on the ground. These partnerships have provided us with data sets and context which are really necessary to ensure that we are elevating authoritative content across our Microsoft platforms. And we also know that unfortunately journalists often need legal support. So we've developed a partnership with Thomson Reuters Foundation to expand legal support for local newsrooms and journalists and operational aid for displaced journalists from Ukraine and surrounding countries. Again, multifaceted problem requires a multifaceted approach. So we're going to keep trying to help with this problem.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and we'll come back for questions a little bit later. So we see here that big enterprises, corporates, which often have been rather slow movers or not going in the forefront, are really making a big difference in building our trusted connectivity and helping real-time in the site of crisis, combining with latest innovations in technology, but at the same time acquiring data sets and building a rather bigger context around those problems. Craig, I want to move into the human dimension. You have been a long veteran in various types of frontline media in the US as well as around the world. For Wall Street Journal, Foreign Bureau, McClatchy Group, as well as your investments into building new types of connectivity solutions. So not the words, but technologies that help to actually build those networks. So tell us a little bit about the human dimension, especially how informational spaces, media spaces are evolving and what types of trust layers we need to build in there. Teresa mentioned the scale of the problem. The scale of the problem is really big. It's immense, and I think it really transcends the regular understanding of misinformation and disinformation in the society. Ukraine is a digital war, digital Cold War site. And what can we do about it?
Thank you, Sten. Good morning, everyone. This has been an amazingly rich experience of the past day and will continue to be today. So to make it easy, if you just remember one thing from the couple of minutes I'm going to speak about, please remember this. History does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Sometimes it rhymes. And what we've heard this morning shows us and echoes for me that the 24th of February 2022 echoes with the 7th of December 1941, when the Wall Street Journal on the 8th of December began its front page report by saying, World War means, I'm paraphrasing a bit, the transformation of America's industrial economy. And that was very prescient and was right. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is that war in the Ukraine, as devastating as the human consequences are, and I'll speak about that for journalists in Ukraine in a second, As consequential as the human dimension has been, means the dramatic transformation of IT, cyber services, and the entire way that our civic health will be lived in a digital life. I'll talk about that more in a moment. The human dimension for journalists is very dramatic. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we've seen more than 24 journalists killed and 8 journalists killed in the line of duty for journalists. And as a former war correspondent myself, 8 journalists killed for doing what their job is, which is trying to report the truth. And Teresa mentioned all the activities now that are required from large platform and technology companies to enable that truth to reach us all. And now I'll lighten it up a little bit. Happily, I started at the Wall Street Journal when I was only 10 years old. I was a little older. But I started at the Wall Street Journal in an era of pencils and conveyor belts carrying copy to a wire room. And when I came to Europe in the 1980s with the Wall Street Journal Europe's launch, I ran a telex machine. In my career, at the convergence of technology, media, and telecom, we've gone from satellite and telexes to now investing in Web 3.0 and the trusted connectivity stem that's at the core of what we're trying to build. And here, the call in this transformation to the IT economy is a collective action for all of us. We know about the global gateway. A person with my accent can't say that without remarking on the importance of the transatlantic partnership in driving that. But in recognizing that this isn't a winner-take-all effort for Silicon Valley where I live or for champions in any part of the globe, it has to come back to our core fundamental principles that we have to remind ourselves, get back to why those journalists are in Ukraine and why they're reporting to report that truth. Trusted networks need truth. And in hardening cyber defenses, in allowing that, we have to remember that there will inevitably be trade-offs. When I started in the early days of the internet at one of the first search engines, we perhaps were naive in believing that connectivity, which as we discussed yesterday, which was built for many different reasons than the applications we see at DIA now, would lead to better outcomes for all of us. And perhaps it was naive to not anticipate the bad actors that we've seen arise. Black hats, whether it's coming from black hat hackers or whether it's coming from black hat nation states, which broke into the servers of a competitor, McClatchy, shortly before the 2020 election and navigated through the server structure in a chilling thing to me as the CEO of one of America's largest news companies at that point. So we have to remember that this is a constant balancing act, and this is an entreaty for us to work from here in Tallinn to build the next phase of hardening our approach to this. Because the one thing that will be worse than having black hat actors that can enter our open and free exchange of ideas and that truth that drives the trusted networks will be eliminating our ability to communicate and get that truth.
Craig, I want to come into 2 points here. So first of all, how many of you have thinking about truth as infrastructure? So I want to come to kind of 2 examples. Who in your ecosystems is providing truth as infrastructure? It's a question to you all. Supposedly there is an actor that comes into our domain, as they do in Ukraine, and the truth infrastructure is being taken off. Who is taking responsibility? Is it your chief of staff? Is it your broadcaster? Is it your media space? Are your organizations powered to a capacity where they will be able to maintain that particular infrastructure? For example, if power outages, as we were warned a few weeks ago, where is that responsibility line? We tend to think about truth in many ways as something very intrinsic, but at the same time where truth as infrastructure and as very much of a physical infrastructure is being attacked, who is responsible? What types of investments, what types of backup plans, from really physical backup plans, technology backup plans, data moving backup plans, as we actually heard about yesterday, needs to be in place. So again, what the frameworks in maintaining the truth infrastructure are already present in our corporate domains, in our innovation domains, in our governance domains is the key questions. Also, we have to think about, and Craig, perhaps you can reflect the experience of the Kiev Independent. A few days ago, we had a lengthy call, again, out of Ukraine, talking about Kiev Independent, which is an organization that has started to build a new truth infrastructure out of Ukraine on a purely trusted connectivity network basis. Would you like to reflect on that, please?
Sure, and let me do that quickly, and also let me bring in a reference to Anna and what she's doing in guiding ethics at Respeecher and for the world of algorithmic news and information and speech. So at the Kiev Independent, and Darina Shevchenko, the CEO there, courageously leading a small newsroom, she points out in the midst of the difficulties of reporting in Ukraine, a small independent newsroom, that metadata and other information that are part of our digital ecosystem, something that wasn't available to the Wall Street Journal in its four-sided 1941 column, allow us to do reporting and to verify information when done correctly, that allow us to understand that there is no ambiguity about what happened in Bucha. There is no ambiguity about what happened in Bucha. I don't need to repeat it a third time. The data sets will confirm reporting that happened contemporaneously, but perhaps was not gathered by any single reporter. And we can see that from geolocation tagging and many other metadata that allow us to understand exactly what happened. We have not yet seen in the news environment the next phase of that part of news gathering, which is going to be heavy on data and intelligence. This is what we're looking at NextNews Ventures, where I am in Silicon Valley. The next phase of reporting will be based much more on data and on analytics that are only beginning to arise. And there are many promising startups in this area. But the reason why I bring in Anna, let me do it for you, Anna, it might be easier, is that at the same time as you all have been doing your I will call it spoofing of Obama's voice, or the techniques that have allowed Respeecher to show what's possible, you've been building the ethics ideas so that we can interdict deep fakes and understand when deep fakes are being presented that can be almost as good or sometimes better than the actual reporting. And this is quite significant in the core of truth, I think.
Yes, and the fact that our adversary hasn't used them yet in that type of capacity doesn't mean that it will happen not in our energy crisis in the upcoming long, cold winter and so forth, because the tools are available. Now the question is, in what types of approaches we want to start either regulating or developing from the best practices and learnings on the ground.
And that's why I'll just finish by saying I hope we can take from here an action plan to create, and many of us are quite, in some ways, informally working on that, an action group to begin to look into hardening our networks of information and digital infrastructure with regard to these kinds of activities so that we're ready, a little as we saw in the 2030 vision for Ukraine. You know, never not let a crisis not be an opportunity, I suppose, is another trite sentence, and I don't mean to suggest that anyone would wish the difficulties that Anna or Darina or others in Ukraine are suffering, but the opportunity that comes from this challenge is to propel ourselves forward, to harden our systems for the next phase of onslaught.
So, to conclude on your remarks, 34 journalists since the start of the war, 34 journalists.
Well, and media personnel killed in missile attacks. Not all of them reporting on the front
losing
lines.
their life of maintaining truth as infrastructure so we could act. So I think the key takeaway here is to actively find ways in order to enable the core layer of what we have been talking here for the 2 days. Guy-Philippe, you are very much working in cyber simulation, very much working in understanding the larger strategic aims where both private actors, governments, and societies at large work. Again, in order to scale, we need to have trust. How do we actually maintain them, again, in an environment where things are either foggy or they're very much cooling?
Yes, indeed. Thanks for the introduction, and great to be here. And actually, I'll come up with a couple of words which, to some extent, are complementary to what has been said by Anna with regards to resilience, and also by Teresa with regards to the element of what you would call cyber influence operation, what other people in the military would call cognitive attacks, for example. And the strategic reason why we do need to think about all those important things that have been said is that indeed, just imagine that after Ukraine wins, because Ukraine will win, we may still face a very revengeful Russia.
So, in other words, what happens when the cannon stops firing?
Absolutely. And we are indeed, to a large extent, in that Cold War 2.0, that digital Cold War that will start in, that will kick in, well, Russia, and perhaps other guys, but at least Russia, will throw out those cyber, those hybrid, those cyber influence operation or cognitive operation, cognitive attacks. And the strategic element here, which is very real, and I really want to insist on that, is that if one major Western country falls prey to this at any stage, Russia could actually perhaps snatch victory at the jaws of defeat. We have to be very mindful of that at this stage. And it's because actually today the Western countries are offering a very vulnerable terrain for those cognitive attacks, for extremist forces which are actually supported by Russia. And that's why when actually we think of trusted connectivity, we absolutely need to go beyond pipes, beyond wires, beyond hardware. We actually need to really be human-centric, because that is where that cognitive battle is going to take place. And because if we don't do so, as just said, we may lose. We need to go into that semantic layer, and we need to actually, complementary to what's been said in terms of identifying the cyber influence operation, we need then to rebuild the cognitive resilience in our societies. So that when the enemy going into the cognitive battlefield throws the equivalent of, say, tanks at us, they are not attacking easy, vast, wide open plains, but actually high up, rock-solid mountains. And that's another way we can defend against that. So question is, right, but how do we rebuild cognitive resilience for society? It's a huge topic. And on that, I'll add additional complementary dimensions in terms of resilience building, namely, 1, decentralized organization, B, individual agency, and 3, training and preparation. So the goal here actually is to build a new architecture of trust for organizations and society as a whole. So I'll start, A, the decentralized organization, basically, to some extent, it's going back to what Paul Barham explained, thinking about the internet, the fact that you don't have any single point of failure, the fact that you don't have any central point controlling everything. That means also no entrenched camps or division that would help the flow of information, connections, communication, which is very important to have resilient, in a topological way, resilient systems. So, okay, how do you translate that into human-centric social networks? So it's still an experimental area, I must insist on that, but there are inspirations across the world. One example would be what Audrey Tang in Taiwan has managed to do with the V-Taiwan platform, as a way not to try to foster fear and diverging views, which is what US social networks are doing for commercial purposes, but actually to create critical and converging views, okay? And one could also look, for example, at local social networks. I know one example of that in France, Open Bubble, which is a way to foster meaningful conversations, friendly connections. By the way, the local press has a huge place to play, and social networks around local press, because studies that show that when you have strong local press, you have fewer polarization. But all that, at the end of the day, are here to foster a critical element of resilience, which is the one of social capital, the concept by Robert Putnam, that has been identified, for example, as a key driver for recovery in areas after natural catastrophe. And what matters thus in this human-centric approach to trusted cognitivity is a very simple and very important thing, which is to actually reconnect people. And I really, really want to stress that. It's an idea as simple as that, but as important as that at this stage. Okay. Then second point, the element of individual agency. That is evidently the ability to let agents to act in an autonomous way, to do their own decision. Let's go back, to Helmut von Moltke and the idea of track tactic in the military or in mission command, what we know in NATO doctrine. That is, again, to leave autonomy to officers on the ground to take decisions. Here, again, for our human-centric social networks, that means a call for engagement, for involvement. Okay? Part of that could be the converging social networks I've already mentioned, or other fora online that would lead actually to compromise building and actual action, and the local space, by the way, could be another area for that. But that also requires for the individual tool for self-assessment, for building your own milestone, for taking personal control of your own mood and your own emotion. And the development of personal productivity tools and digital mental, let's call it warfare, do offer promises in that venues. And finally, the element of training and preparation. So that is in resilience for very obvious reasons, because the best way to confront a shock is to have already been confronted to it. And that's what any military will tell you. And they would do for that, for example, with exercise training, simulation, and war games. And to some extent, and they are thinking here in Europe about that, the use of more digital serious games or even local or national exercises. That could be great ways to, again, bringing people together and show up that element of training and preparation, and to do that both on the community and individual training.
Guy-Philippe, let me just ask you on here. So we understand that building trusted connectivity at human level is a key goal and an asset. And you spoke about training. How can we actually implement that training from the domain of a tactical command into a corporate governance, public sector, startup, human domain?
So there are many different ways to do that, and actually, thank you for the question, because it's part of things I'm doing in France right now. For example, both for the French Defense Innovation Agency, but also for corporates, both for corporate questions, but also for cyber exercise training. And at the end of the day, the key element is the ability to build a sandbox, a gaming environment, serious gaming environment, and there are many ways to do that. And to have people then train and exercise in those places, and be able then to think imaginatively, for example, to future shocks that would come, and then take the lessons out of that. And the key element here is not necessarily the lessons, the ideas that will be found, but actually building the muscle of thinking of an uncertain environment, the way that pilots would train all the time. This may be the way we should be training in an environment which will be more and more uncertain. And to do that, evidently, in an individual way, but also, and that's very important, in a collective way. And that's very important. I will end up on that, because that, again, fits to the element of resilience, which is, again, about connecting or reconnecting people. And that's a key element.
Thank you, Guy-Philippe. So, if I would turn back to Teresa very quickly, and Anna, what are the key 3 messages for you for corporate actors who might be hesitant to move into Ukraine, to act on Ukraine, on fast, on pace, on methods which are, I would say, rather opposite to the usual corporate cadence? What would be your key messages to encourage others?
I can start. It's urgent. You must act. The world is depending on you.
Anna.
I would just make it clear that for everyone to remember that Ukraine is defending and fighting not only for its freedom, but for the democratic values that are shared worldwide in Western world. And when we talk about engaging fast in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, it's not should be considered from the position of helping, but it's from the position of partnerships. And what at Respeecher I've seen for this half a year that I'm head of ethics and partnerships is that even a small entity and company as Respeecher is, we are already exporter of knowledge. and expertise. And
Thank
when
you.
we talk about trust,
Yes?
trust-based infrastructure, right? I'm echoing myself, that's why I'm really stopping sometimes. When we see information ecosystem and what influence digital content has to it. So when we protect metadata, when we would, for example, at Respeecher develop watermarking that is not deletable, when we would develop detection tools that would help civil society and policymakers detect those novel ways of abusing and threatening information ecosystem, that's the knowledge that we are ready to share. And I would always call for international partners to consider ourselves as partners based on values. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if I draw this conversation this morning together, so what did we hear? Speed, impact, ethics. We're always thinking about top-down. Perhaps now we should really think about ground-up. We definitely see that B corporates can move into these spaces by providing infrastructure, knowledge, frameworks, and scalable tools that are operational very fast. We see that an NGO space, which somewhat is often contested, can actually catalyze ecosystems. So we're not anymore talking about deployments, but we are talking about ecosystems. Truth as infrastructure. We take it for granted, but it's vulnerable. How do you go back to your ecosystems and start really thinking about how do you maintain truth as infrastructure? How do you power those actors that are enabling the truth that everything builds upon? And finally, training and exercises. Have we built our muscle? Have we built our resilience muscle? Have we built our visionary muscle, our operational muscle to actually build that trusted connectivity? Thank you very much.
Thank you.